Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final speaker series event for the academic year for the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the director of the center. I'd like to start by thanking the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for co-sponsoring this event, as well as the sponsors of our speaker series as a whole, which are Cleary Gottlieb, Cravath, Davis Polk, DLA Piper, Latham and Watkins, Paul Weiss, Sullivan and Cromwell, Wachtell Lipton, Weil, and White and Case. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Jill Filipovich. A weekly columnist for CNN, Jill's work on gender, politics, and international affairs has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and other prestigious venues. She's the author of 2 books, The H-Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness, and more recently, the terrific book, OK Boomer, Let's Talk, How My Generation Got Left Behind. I'd be remiss if I didn't also add that she is an esteemed alum of NYU Law, and I'm thrilled to have her back at the law school. Before I open up the discussion, let me go over some logistics for those of you who are seeking CLE credit. Please pay attention throughout the presentation and look out for any codes that I announce during the session. Soon after the event, you'll receive an email link to an attorney affirmation form where you'll be asked to submit the code or codes to receive credit. Please don't walk away from your screen because the codes could show up at any time. Toward the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So I want to start, Jill, with some of the biases and stereotypes we hear about both millennials and boomers. Early in your book, you describe the tropes about millennials. Quote, "We're delicate, special snowflakes, demanding safe spaces and trigger warnings. We're obsessed with identity politics and sneer, check your privilege, instead of debating in good faith. We expect to be rewarded and promoted and head patted and handheld. We're self-indulgent, perpetual adolescents who refuse to grow up." End quote. And it goes on. Where do these ideas about millennials come from? And is there any validity to them?
I'm glad you started with the stereotypes. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be back at NYU. And thanks to everyone who has showed up to hear this conversation. I'm excited for it. So I honestly think a lot of these millennial stereotypes come from right-wing media. I think there is this kind of anti-millennial outrage complex that has been building for the last 10 years or so. And one thing that was really interesting to me researching this book is I read a lot of the contemporaneous writing about baby boomers when they were more the age of millennials or a little younger, when they were in their 20s and 30s. So there was a whole book called The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Latch. And then there was a very famous Tom Wolfe essay for New York Magazine called The Me Generation about boomers. And so many of these stereotypes you really see overlapping. So the narrative about boomers is that they were narcissists, they were hyper individualistic, they were obsessed with wellness and their own personal development and feeling special and individual. Nobody was using the word snowflake back then, but that was certainly the general vibe. And what you hear about millennials now, right, is, oh, we've all gotten participation trophies our whole lives. We're hypersensitive. We also want to feel special. We're incredibly narcissistic. So a lot of this I do think is just kind of kids these days, frustrations that older folks are always leveling against the younger ones. I'm sure when millennials are older, we're going to be complaining about whatever we name, the generation being born now. But then some of it, I think, serves a pretty overt political purpose. I do think we've seen this real media shift in the last decade or two, that has obviously contributed to huge political polarization in the US, but that also needs an enemy. And one of those enemies is the young. Millennials aren't actually that young anymore, but the term millennial has become kind of shorthand for, woke college students or out of control liberals, or, whatever you want to call it. And so I do think that's where a lot of the stereotypes come from. In terms of what's true, I do think it's true that millennials, or it is demonstrably true that millennials are a more politically progressive generation than baby boomers. We are overwhelmingly liberal. Not entirely, but largely, whereas boomers are split pretty much down the middle between liberal and conservative. Millennials are more open and accepting of, for example, LGBT people. We say that issues like racism are more important to confront. So yes, some of that stuff is true. I see that as we are just a more empathetic and open generation. I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. It actually leads directly into my next question, which is, on the other side, right, we have stereotypes and biases against boomers as well. So here, they're selfish, they hoard resources for themselves, they're backward politically, they're rigid in their attitudes to work-life balance, they're addicted to holding on to power and refusing to hand over reins to younger generations. So you're writing as a millennial. I promise, as someone who's in Gen X, I'm in kind of, at least for these purposes, neutral territory, so I won't take any of this personally. Much of your book is a critique of what boomers have done to your generation. So my original question was, are these stereotypes of boomers more valid than the ones of millennials? And I just wanted to tag onto that, given your response to the last question. Is this also something that is just something that's going to attach to boomers because they have just moved through the generations and they happen to occupy a certain age group, such that when you, some decades from now are in the same position as a millennial, you'll be subjected to these stereotypes too? And to what extent can we say, no, this actually isn't just, a bolus moving through a python, but rather is something that is truly distinctive to this cohort?
So I think you're right that some of this is the reverse of what I was saying earlier, which is there is always youth resentment of the old, right? And so the idea that boomers are uniquely rigid, I would imagine that most generations of young people look at older folks and think, well, they're rigid, they're stuck in the past, they're more conservative, they're more staid. So I do think some of this is just as it ever was, right? Cycling through generations. I do think where some of the stereotypes or frustrations around things like resource hoarding come from is this widespread millennial resentment and frustration with where we've ended up in life. And when you look at the economic data, that's a real thing. It may be unfair to pin that stereotype on every single baby boomer, right? And I certainly don't think that every single individual baby boomer is responsible for where we've wound up. But I do think collectively, their generation does have quite a bit to answer for. I think what often goes missing in these conversations is that the stereotype of the baby boomer, at least when you're talking about stereotypes that come from kind of the left side of the political aisle, is that they're conservative. And so certainly when I'm complaining about baby boomers, the boomer I'm typically imagining, is the boomer who in their first election cast a vote for Ronald Reagan, the first election in which all baby boomers could vote, ushered Reagan into office. The boomer who now, watches Fox News and is, perhaps a Trump voter and is a pretty reactive person. That really is only half of the boomer generation, right? So you have this whole other half that is much more politically progressive and I think really resents a lot of the okay boomer conversation, understandably, because they feel like this doesn't apply to me. Where I would say the stereotype that I think does apply to not every boomer, but sort of overwhelmingly is the one about resource hoarding. That is true both from a sort of political and economic perspective. It's also true that one thing boomers did is invest huge, significant resources into their own children and families, which, again, rational thing for parents to do. But in a country like the US, where resources are not not equitably distributed, and certainly are highly inequitably distributed on the basis of race. What that's done is entrench and re-entrench existing inequalities that now, in a more racially diverse millennial generation, result in the most unequal society that we've seen in the US in decades.
Thank you for that. So this is where it does get a little bit personal, although I promise to keep it as an analytic question. Where do generations X and Z, fit into this discussion? So we were chatting a little bit earlier, and I identified myself as Gen X, and you mentioned that this actually comes up a lot, right, in the various talks that you've given off of this very well-received book. But I do find it fascinating, just generally as an analytic matter, that there's a particular rivalry going on between boomers and millennials. But there's a whole generation sandwiched in between those two. And then another younger generation, you could just say, well, they're too young to actually be in this conversation. But some of those Gen Zers are already in their 20s. So what accounts for the kind of erasure of Gen X and Gen Z in this conversation?
Yeah, every time I do one of these events or even like tweet about this, I get so many angry Gen Xers being like, "Where are we?" And I was joking about this to you before. They're kind of like the Jan Brady of the generation wars, right? Just like stuck in the middle and completely invisible. I think that's in part because Gen X is a much smaller generation than baby boomers and millennials. So boomers obviously were the largest American generation in history. And then you had Gen Xers, kind of this narrower slice, and millennials have just recently surpassed boomers as the largest generation of American adults. And so I think part of it is just sort of a pure numbers issue, that boomers were so numerically dominant, they became culturally dominant. And you're seeing the same thing. Gen Xers have never managed and never will manage to surpass boomers number wise, which means that they don't have as much political power, which means they don't have as much cultural influence. Millennials have just surpassed boomers, but we still don't have the same amount of political power that boomers had when they were our age, which I think tells you something about how boomers have retained power and influence that I think at this point is kind of even outside of their numbers. Gen Z, I do think we need to be paying more attention to them. I mean, the oldest Gen Zers are now in their early 20s. And when you look at, for example, the impact of coronavirus shutdowns and who it's really impacted, it's a lot of young women. It's a lot of young women of color. So Gen Z women of color are, we'll see how this all shakes out. But from what I can tell, a group that is getting very particularly screwed by this. And yet, as far as I can tell, there's very little attention being paid politically to how we serve that group and make sure they don't wind up the way that, for example, millennials wound up after the 2008 recession.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful answer to talk about sort of the numerosity of Gen X relative to the boomer generation. But that, again, sort of leads me to a deeper question, which is how useful is it to, periodize people in this way, right? How useful is it to lump people together in a cohort by generation and then engage in these kinds of generalizations? So some critics of the generation wars suggest that the whole exercise of defining people by their age and suggesting that they share a common identity with other people born in the same time period is mistaken at its core. So how would you respond to that?
I honestly think that's a very well taken point, despite having just written a book that did exactly that. All of these generation definitions are going to be imperfect, right? For example, Donald Trump is a baby boomer, so is Kamala Harris. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Those two people don't share many cultural similarities, right? What they watched on television was different. The politics that defined their young lives were different. Donald Trump was born in 1946, so the first year of the baby boom. Kamala Harris was born in 64, the last year. And Gen X loves to claim her, and maybe they've earned it. But so, that example to me, I think really shows the degree to which these generational groupings are imperfect. That said, I do think there is something useful about understanding how age cohorts kind of move from childhood through adulthood and are shaped by and then shape in return their society and culture. The fact that we're putting brackets on the end of any of these is going to mean that folks kind of on the cusp are perhaps not going to find this analysis quite as relevant to their lives. But I do think it's useful, for example, to think about millennials as the generation that broadly, we're young people when September 11th happened, whether we were in middle school, high school, or college. And then we're kind of very early stage workers when the 2008 recession happened. That's not true for every millennial, but I think that is an important, the generation gathering and sort of putting that big umbrella over us as millennials, I think is an important mechanism for understanding how those events shaped our politics, our culture, our work lives, and our financial lives.
Good. So just to follow up, it would be common experiences then that would justify this kind of periodization. Okay,
Exactly.
good. So, now that we've done some kind of table setting definitional questions, I want to kind of roll up our sleeves and get into it, right? Because you're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, many of the attendees today are lawyers, and at our center, we hear all the time from law firms where these generational disputes play out every day, as they do in other professional work settings. A lot of the differences seem to boil down to different attitudes towards work-life balance, right? So, one comment that I recently got was, oh, those millennials are unionized as a generation, right, for better work-life balance. And it was said in actually half admiring, half grudging way. So could you describe some of those attitudinal differences for us?
Sure. So I think some of this is cultural and some of it is a direct response to the economic conditions that millennials entered the workplace in. Um, I think there are stereotypes that millennials don't want to work hard. I don't think that's true at all. I think when you look at how much millennials work, that really sort of proves that stereotype false. But I think millennials are interested in working differently. I think there's a sense that many of us have that we are never going to be as stable as our parents. We may never be as stable as our grandparents. And yet we are in this kind of intense culture of overwork and hustle and nose to the grindstone. And so if we're going to be doing all of that, we want to at least bring some sort of pleasure into it. We want some sense of control. So I see on your graphic, you have work-life balance and work flexibility, and all those things are really important to young people. And millennials, I guess, aren't that young anymore. We're between the ages of like 25 and 40 at this point. But there is a real cultural difference there. I think there's more of a rejection of hierarchy among millennials, a sense that, again, we're willing to work hard, but we want to be rewarded based on what we're producing and not just, well, I've been here for X number of years and therefore I've climbed up. Millennials, there are more millennial women in the workplace than any generation of women before us, although we don't actually get paid much better than baby boomer women did at our age. I think a lot of millennial women are looking at the very important gains that the second wave feminist movement made, but then asking, well, why isn't this better by now? So boomer women were really extraordinary in entering the workforce in record numbers. But there unfortunately wasn't sort of an attendant shift in the way that workplaces actually function. And so workplaces that had been set up, right, according to this norm of a breadwinner husband and a stay-at-home wife, let women in, but didn't actually shift anything fundamental about how that workplace functioned. And I think for boomer women, it was such a fight just to get through the door that there really wasn't time to say, okay, well, we're also now going to do all the political work of, trying to reform every piece of this. And then there frankly wasn't the political ability given the sort of rise of conservatism and sort of Reagan era conservatism in the 80s that blocked a lot of these attempts at change. Millennial women, I think, are coming in now and asking, well, okay, we've gone through the door. None of us really thought we wouldn't get through the door, right? It was sort of, at least when I was growing up, it was certainly expected that I would work. That was an outstanding question. But now that we're here, like, why is it that this still isn't working for so many of us? And so I think you see those questions animating a lot of the discussion today around, what is it millennials want? That we want flexibility, that we want to be able to work from home, that we want our workplaces to really allow us to have a life. I think that's both a response to the sort of unfinished work of feminism. I think it's a response to our economic material reality. I also think it's reflective of a kind of millennial idealism. that also animates our generation.
How big of a transformation do you think is going to be required here then? Because you mentioned that the first generation of women were just trying to get through the door so that they're willing to sort of assimilate, if you will, to the existing norms, and that this next generation of women might want more. We sometimes hear frustration from law firm partners who, I think are very open-minded and very kind of other regarding, who say, millennials expect to be able to go to the yoga class, at 6 p.m., even when there's an urgent client deadline, right? So what would you say to the boomer lawyers in the audience who, and I originally had this as, who think millennials just don't work hard enough? I think you've answered that. I think you've said, like, we do work just as hard. But I think you're granting that one difference is that you want more flexibility, if I heard you correctly, right? And so, what would you say to that, lawyer who not only says, I had to go through this myself, which, I think we can both agree isn't a strong enough answer, but then who says, this just isn't the way the profession is structured. We're client services. When the client says jump, we have to say how high. Part of why we're being paid so much is because the client is putting an option on our time. Like, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I understand all of that. I worked at a law firm for several years after NYU. Great firm, and I really enjoyed working there. But one thing that was incredibly striking to me as a young associate was noticing how even at a law firm that I think really went out of its way to make life doable for its lawyers, the number of male partners who would stay-at-home wives who took care of every aspect of their lives, and the way that that made those partners very blind to what kind of a full life looked like for the rest of us, right? So I was a single woman working at that law firm. I still had to do my own dry cleaning. I still had to make my own lunches. I still, had to make my own dinners on the very few nights that I was home early enough to have dinner. I was arranging my own social calendar. And I sort of watched over and over again as, men had someone else taking care of all of that invisible work, someone else who was keeping the house in order, who was raising kids, which is a tremendous amount of work. Someone, I know I've mentioned the dry cleaning thing, but, somebody who was available during basic open working hours of the day to make sure that their lives functioned, and how invisible so much of that labor was. And looking at that and thinking to myself, well, of course these guys can work 12 or 13 or 14 hours a day because, and they can still quote unquote have it all, right? They can go home to a nice house that's clean with two, well attended to children and the dog. And I didn't see female partners who had that. Most of the female partners also had working spouses. And from what I observed, that was a tremendous amount of pressure. I also observed a lot of competition for mentorship from female partners, right? So, and then this sort of assumption and expectation that female partners should mentor all of the young women, expectations that were not put to the same degree on every single male partner. And I saw that a lot of that stuff was completely unrecognized and unaccounted for. And I think there's a lot of reasons why I did not stay working as a lawyer. But one of them was that I think I looked toward that future and didn't really see that it was going to be possible for me to have a life that was as rich and layered as the lives of many of the male partners that I observed, and still do that job. So, I know that is not a completely perfect answer. I understand that, there are client demands. I don't think any lawyers, certainly not law firm lawyers that I know, would say that what I want is to be able to go home at 5 and close my laptop and not look at it until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. I think what folks are saying is, can we fold in some humane ways to allow us to do this job without the kind of FaceTime requirements, with an understanding that, when you are requiring people to work 13, 14, 15 hours a day, every day, and there's still an inequitable gender distribution of labor at home, you are not going to get equality in your gender equality in your partnership level. When men don't take leave, right? And only women take leave, and only women go into the part-time track, that sends a really distinct message about who we assume is in charge of what. I think one of the most important things that male leaders, whether they're a partner or just a well-respected member of the firm, can do is take their full parental leave when they have kids and do it for every kid and don't work the whole time. And send the message that's not only okay, but that's the expectation here. Um, it's a small thing, but I think that would go a long way to culture setting. But at the end of the day, the way in which law firms work and the demands that they are leveraging on their attorneys, I'm not sure it's totally sane. I'm not sure it's justified. I'm not sure it's necessary. And now every law firm hopefully will not like de-invest from paying for this series now that I told them all to work less. But I do think that sort of mentality of hyperwork and overwork only works if you have a primary breadwinner model. And almost nobody has that anymore.
Yeah, and I'm embarrassed to say that I had a bit of an aha as you were talking, which I probably should have had years ago, right? Which is to say, I was thinking, oh, this sounds a lot more like a gender talk than a generational talk, right? But what you're saying is that, as I hear you, is that those two things are like, completely intertwined with each other, right? Because one of the things that distinguishes the generations is the different expectations, right, of men and women in the workplace. So if you have a more egalitarian workplace, the older model is simply not going to work. So the younger generation is going to be the more feminist generation, and the more feminist generation is going to be the younger generation. Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah. And I think COVID has been a really radicalizing moment for a lot of young women. And not young women, a lot of women generally, and I think a lot of mothers specifically, seeing what happens when all of those kind of external things we had set up to allow us to quote unquote have it all, which is a term I hate, when all those things fall apart, right? And then it's just you maybe alone, or you and maybe your partner, having to navigate this stuff. And what we've seen overwhelmingly is that it's women who get stuck navigating it. Nearly all of the COVID job losses were women's jobs, and most of those women were mothers, which I think tells you a lot about how little support women have both in the workplace and at home.
Yeah, and I promise our viewers that I did not share these questions in advance, but that's actually the perfect segue to the next one, which is, we need a kind of hard reset. And I'm wondering if there isn't like a potential good news story, right, off of COVID, right, for millennials. So the question I had was, given that most people in office jobs have been working remotely for over a year now, do you think that attitudes towards flexible and remote work will change after the pandemic, right? It might have taken like a seismic global event to do this, but we've had a seismic global event, right? Will people be expected to resume full-time in-person work, or has a pandemic forced employers to see remote work arrangements in a new light from where you sit?
Yeah, I think it really has changed the game. So I do think COVID has demonstrated the degree to which remote work can work. And I'm hopeful, very hopeful, that we will see a shift. Not that your law firm is going to go 100% remote, right? But there'll just be more flexibility around, all right, it's a Wednesday, I have X, Y, and Z to do around here. Like, I'm going to work from home, and that'll be okay. Or I'm going to work, for a week from, I don't know, my family's cabin upstate or whatever it might be, so that I can spend a little more time with the people that I care about. I'm sort of two minds on this. I think it's really positive that there is a shift toward more flexibility. I think the other thing that COVID has brought, and I haven't seen this yet documented super well, although there's some kind of like early research on it. We're all working, those of us that still have jobs, are working much more during COVID. And already, even from millennials from our grandparents' generation to millennials, Americans have begun working much, much, much more. So we work an extra month per year than we did half a century ago. From what I've observed via COVID is because everyone's boss knows you have nothing else going on, right? Like, you can't really go out, you can't travel. There's been an expectation that now you are always on and you are always working. And certainly among my peers, and this is purely anecdotal, what I hear from everyone is, well, now it just never stops. You're expected to be available all the time. The work week is now 7 days instead of 5 days. There's no hesitation to infringe upon your weekend, because there's an assumption now that all you do is, sit on your couch on your laptop. And so that to me is the danger of remote and quote unquote flexible work, is that employers will see that flexibility as then permission to assume that you are flexible 100% of the time. So yeah, in my ideal universe, we would come out of COVID reversing that assumption, right, with sort of stronger boundaries between work and home, with also this the idea that you can work from anywhere, that work does not have to be in one physical place in one office.
That's really helpful. So I guess it remains to be seen whether or not the kind of elasticity will cause us to stretch outward or inward, right, with regard to the contours of work. So I actually now want to sort of switch to a different topic, if I may. And aside from work-life balance, we see other generational differences in the conflict between millennials and boomers, and particularly this view about kind of hierarchy and authority in the workplace, the length of time that people spend working for a single employer, attitudes to teamwork and collaboration, and for our center's purposes, attitudes towards diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So could you share with us the millennial viewpoint, on some of these topics and how those viewpoints can create friction with boomer colleagues? And I'm of course using millennial and boomer as you do in a kind of fairly stylized way. I'm not saying every millennial or every boomer holds these attitudes.
Sure. So one stereotype that we hear a lot about millennials is that we're job hoppers, right? That we're totally disloyal and that we switch jobs all the time. That's actually not true. Young people switch jobs. So yes, millennials switch jobs a lot in their 20s. Boomers also switch jobs a lot in their 20s. There's really not any evidence that millennials switch jobs more than anyone else. And I think, now that we're in our 30s and segueing into our 40s, it'll be interesting to see what that data looks like in 10 or 20 years. If millennials do stay as people who change jobs, or if we do what boomers did and in our 30s settle into something long term. So the turnover thing I think is less true. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, I think that's 100% correct about millennials, and that's in part because millennials are a super diverse generation. I've mentioned women in the workplace, but in terms of racial diversity, millennials are the most racially diverse adults in American history. Gen Z is more racially diverse than we are, but they're not all adults yet. And so, of course, when you have a more racially diverse generation, that generation is going to say, well, wait a minute, I want a place at the table too. And the story of America, including American workplaces, is a story of racial exclusion and racial hierarchy. We see this in data around pay, right? And everybody at this point knows that there's a significant gender pay gap and there's a significant racial pay gap. And when you overlap those things, then obviously the people that do the worst are Black and Hispanic women. When you have a racially diverse generation who are also the most educated generation in American history, I think there's a lot of questioning about why we haven't solved this problem yet. And a lot of thought put into what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of country do we want to live in? And how do we want our workplaces to reflect that? I think because American politics can often feel impenetrable and quite slow to change, I think a lot of efforts get focused on, I think understandably, on the workplace. And saying, how do we make these spaces more equitable and more welcoming? And then there's, I think, some work, but frankly, not enough in really getting into the nuts and bolts numbers of things and saying, okay, not just how do we all, use kind of the right language, but how do we really make sure that people are paid fairly and given opportunities not just to be hired, but be promoted and have their work evaluated fairly? I think those questions are still somewhat unsolved. But I do see a lot of millennials grappling with them and pushing their workplaces to be more transparent and thoughtful about how they approach them.
Thank you for that. One of the things I truly admire about this book is how wide-ranging it is. So I now want to leave the workplace. Your book travels far beyond the workplace to explore issues relating to money, housing, family, and culture, among other topics. So let's start with money. You note that millennials are the most credentialed generation in American history and the most broke, quote unquote. Why are millennials broke, right? And since you wrote most of your book prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, what impact has the pandemic had on millennials' financial position? So you talked about this with regard to gender already, but maybe you could pick it up again for millennials.
Definitely. So, I mean, there's a couple of reasons why millennials are the most broke. That we're going to be the first generation that will do worse, not only than our parents, but than our grandparents. Um, I think the number one story that often gets kind of glossed over here is a race story. Um, in the US, I know I mentioned this earlier, but our American wealth is distributed according to race. White, right? White families have a lot more than families of color, and white families have a lot more than black families in particular, by many, many magnitudes. So boomers were a pretty overwhelmingly white generation, somewhere in the universe of 80% white. Um, Millennials now are close to 50, or a little over 50% white, right? So you've seen that money that was concentrated into a large number of white hands become concentrated into a smaller number of white hands. We haven't seen a distribution of that of money to other racial groups. And in fact, when it comes to young people, when it comes to millennials, we actually see worse outcomes. So a Black millennial today is less likely to own a home than his or her grandparents were, right? Before the Voting Rights Act. And before the Fair Housing Act, before all this legislation that was intended to really kind of recalibrate those really significant inequities and imbalances. And so that's a huge driver when you start out with a group of people who have been systemically excluded from the American dream, right? Legally, culturally, often by force. Um, and then we create a system where wealth is inherited and passed down, and things like higher education is very expensive and therefore contingent on whether your parents are able to afford it. What you wind up with is what we see with millennials, which are tremendous racial inequalities across our generation, with millennials of color who are better educated than their parents and grandparents, like white millennials, but often financially far, far worse off. And then when you incorporate that into a generational average, what you get is a generation that is doing worse. One of the statistics that really stood out to me from, I think, a Stanford report, and I'm now forgetting the name of the center, but was that if it weren't for public assistance, so things like SSI and disability and welfare dollars and food stamps, millennials would be the most impoverished generation in a century. So, we're really not doing well. So the race story is a really important piece of it. So is the higher education story, right? Millennials, despite being the best educated generation, are also the poorest. And part of that is because of this dismantling of public support for public education. So we've taken on tremendous student loan debt. The other aspect of that is that we've also seen the bottom fall out, particularly of working class wages. And so essentially a college degree is the new high school degree. For boomers, getting a college degree resulted in a pretty significant pay jump. For millennials, it really doesn't. It just kind of keeps us clawing on to the middle class, whereas not having a college degree sees you get a massive pay deficit, if that makes sense. And so we're spending more money on these degrees, often going into debt. I still have six-figure student loan debt from NYU Law. And then entering an economy in which real wages have stagnated for several decades. So millennials, even with college degrees, are not making the same wages that, for example, boomers with college degrees made. Adding on to that, we were hit quite hard by the 2008 recession. Gen Xers were actually hit the hardest by that recession, but they recovered. Millennials recovered far, far less. And even now, however, what is that, 13 years later? How quickly can I do math? Even now, we haven't recovered fully, and many economists predict we will just never recover. We took a lifelong earnings hit. So I know that's a very long answer, but that is kind of the universe of forces that have all conspired to leave millennials pretty broke and pretty frustrated. And looking at baby boomers, who, when baby boomers were young, saw a government that was spending $3 in future investments on things like education, roads, infrastructure, For every $1 it's spent on entitlements, things like Medicare, um, right. And millennials are now looking at a universe where those things are reversed. So we now spend $3 on entitlements for every dollar that we spend on future investments. And by the time all the baby boomers are retired, it's going to be $5 on entitlements for every dollar that we spend on future investments. So, I think as a millennial, you look at those numbers and you feel pretty neglected and pretty frustrated.
I want to pick up other aspects of the slide, but before I do that, I feel it's incumbent on me to deliver the CLE code. So before I ask the next question, I want to provide the CLE code for those who are watching and seeking CLE credits. So the code is MPG212. Again, that's MPG212. So thanks for indulging us, Jill. Let's go back to the previous slide when we can. And I think you've dealt with the housing issue, and we're a little bit pressed for time because I do want to go to Q&A. So I want to skip down to the culture point. And I was kind of scratching my head a little bit here and hoping you could explain this to me, because from a cultural standpoint, you note in the book that many boomers were the radicals of their time. They were the generation that fought for civil rights, during the Second Reconstruction, second wave feminism, gay rights in the 60s and 70s. So where does this culture gap between the two generations arise? Like, don't boomers and millennials actually have something in common when it comes to fighting for diversity and inclusion?
I think we definitely do. The role of boomers in movements like the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, I think is a complicated one. I think boomers get both kind of credit and blame for those movements. And the reality is, boomers were the foot soldiers of those movements, right? But they weren't the leaders, and they weren't the folks who began those movements. Gloria Steinem is not a boomer. Martin Luther King Jr. is not a boomer. Ruby Bridges is a boomer, right? Bryan Stevenson is a boomer. So I think it's important when we think about those movements and who were the kind of public faces of them versus who were the often, high school students, or in the case of Ruby Bridges, an elementary school student. Who were those folks? Those are the baby boomers. And those folks are still the folks who are active leading these movements today, right? I mentioned Bryan Stevenson. Loretta Ross is a baby boomer. A lot of the folks who are on the forefront of these movements, who we don't think of as like old people, who we just think of as, the sort of adults in the room, are boomers. So I think that is an important thing to understand. I think it's also important to understand that as much as every adult today wants to claim that they were, at the March on Washington or would have been, a lot of these movements were really, really unpopular at their time. The civil rights movement was wildly unpopular. The feminist movement was wildly unpopular, including among other baby boomers. So it's not the case that the boomers, even when they were young, were this overwhelmingly liberal kind of storming the gates generation. It was a really important, really influential segment of the boomer generation that was doing that work. And many of those people continue to do that work today, and we know their names. But overwhelmingly, boomers were doing what most people do, which is tend to their families and worry about themselves. So I think a lot of the history there has been a bit rewritten. One thing that sort of strikes me is boomers, as I've said, are this really, really politically polarized generation, more so than any other. They're more split down the middle than Gen Xers or than silent generation members, and certainly more than millennials. I think the liberal baby boomers had a huge impact on American culture, right? On issues of identity and diversity and feminism and racial justice. But the conservative boomers were really the ones who won the politics. Which is why you see in the 80s a massive backlash to the feminist movement and to racial justice movements that was also led by baby boomers, right? So the generation it's both things, and I think has been really characterized and defined by that tension of a chunk of the generation working really, really hard to make social progress, and then this sort of massive backlash, often from the other half of it, which is why you see so many of these projects still going unfinished.
That's so helpful. And we're going to move to Q&A in a moment. So this will be my last question. I'm going to try and compress some separate ideas in here. So one of the things that's incredible about your book is like, and I think you've amply demonstrated already in this conversation, is that this is no mere diatribe, right, against boomers. You're really trying to be constructive, to raise awareness, and ultimately even to, as you put it, quote unquote, broker a peace deal, right, between the generations. And so in that vein, I wanted to ask you, we have lots of organizations and lots of leaders, right, who are tuning in today. What can they do to make their workplaces more equitable, across the generations? And then more broadly, if I can tag on to that, do you have any suggestions outside of the workplace as well, where, social policy or a culture could be shifted to create greater generational equity and comedy?
Yeah. I mean, that could be like its whole own.
I know. We'll have to have you back.
I'll try to- I mean, generally, I think the biggest shift that I would love to see from baby boomers is understanding that millennials aren't children anymore. And that one benefit that boomers had is they were given a seat at the table early and often. And granted, that was partly because they had tremendous numbers, but it was partly because their futures were invested in, and there was an idea of adulthood that I think started much earlier for them than it has for millennials. And I'm now going to forget the exact numbers, but the US Senate is a very good example of this. So we just got our first millennial senator elected from Georgia. Previous to that, not a single millennial had ever held a seat in the US Senate. When you look at when baby boomers were roughly the same age millennials are now, there have been several boomers in their 30s who had been senators, including folks like Al Gore, right, who then used that as a jumping off point to a very robust political career. So millennials have not had the political access that boomers had. And I think in workplaces and also in places like nonprofits and organizing movements, kind of anywhere, what we've really seen is that while boomers certainly have a wealth of knowledge, and I am not a person who says like all boomers should go retire and be put out to pasture. I think many boomers who have been doing this kind of work for decades have a tremendous amount to continue to share. But millennials need a seat at the table, and they need a seat at the decision-making table, and younger folks as well. Not just as like, here's the young person who is kind of just standing up there silently, but a real partner in making decisions and in driving where those workplaces go. I would say that this is just how it is, or this is how we've always done things, is not a very good answer when people are raising new ideas or complaints or critiques. From the millennial side of things, I do think many of us could be less dismissive and kind of more understanding of the tremendous amount that we do have to learn from folks who have been here. We didn't invent feminism. We didn't invent movements for racial equality. We didn't invent movements for LGBT equality. There are people who have been doing this work for a long time, not always in the ways that we think are the right ways, right? But we can learn from their efforts, successes, and failures.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A, and I'm actually going to bundle two questions together because they're both talking about sort of broad, irreversible trends that we see in society that may be alternative explanations for these shifts, right? So one is technology, right? This individual says, to what extent, is this changing focus on work-life balance or greater pressure placed on that a reflection of how technology has changed how we work and made it more invasive rather than a true culture shift in our mentalities, right? So we all now have to talk about and set these boundaries with work because they're no longer structurally built into our workplace. Like boomers didn't develop their careers with work email or Slack, right, is the thing. And then the other one that I'd like to actually bundle with that is also this, irreversible trend towards radically greater longevity, right? When my kids went to, their elementary school, for the first time, they were told that they were going to live to be 100, right? And in fact, a child born in the developed West today, is going to statistically live to 104, right? And so isn't that also putting a lot of pressure, right, on this? And isn't that a huge explanatory variable? Because, the boomer isn't going to retire, right, at 65. They're going to work well into their 70s or 80s or even 90s, right? So I'm wondering if those variables are useful, have explanatory force, right, in this picture that you're painting for us.
Yeah, absolutely. On the longevity piece of it, it is true that boomers, being such a numerically enormous generation, and then also living longer than any Americans in the history of the country, and longer than most people in the history of the world, are going to stay in their positions for longer. The average age of a US senator and a US congressperson has gone up significantly, in part because baby boomers and members of the silent generation are hanging on to those roles for much longer. And that one is a tough nut to crack, because I don't want to say every boomer needs to retire at 65. I think that's actually a pretty bad plan for boomers themselves, for their families, and for the country. But I do think we need a way to think through, okay, how do we create workplaces? And again, this goes back to this millennial idea that hierarchy should not define every aspect of our work lives, where simple number of years being in a place is not necessarily the primary means by which a person accrues power. And so I think that definitely requires some creative solution making. But whoever asked that question is absolutely right, that the longevity piece here is tremendously influential. And the tech piece as well, of course. I think one interesting thing that we're seeing, really not in the US, but in some European countries that I think have a much more sensible idea of the role work should play in one's life, are trying to be creative about how do we balance these tech intrusions into our lives. So I think it was France a few years ago passed a law mandating hours within which you are no longer allowed to send work emails, right? And I'm not sure that the US needs a law mandating that, but you can create a workplace norm around when you're expected to open emails. You can create workplace norms and even kind of formal written rules around under which circumstances it's okay to be reaching out outside of work hours. I think technology is amazing. It's obviously saved a lot of jobs and livelihoods during this pandemic, but just because it exists doesn't mean we have to let it take over our lives in its entirety.
Yeah, and some of the organizations that we worked with have put those norms in place. And even as subtle a thing as like a norm that says, just because I, as your boss, send you this email at a certain hour does not mean I expect a response before tomorrow. I'm just getting it off of my plate. That doesn't mean you have to get it off of yours, right? So
I'd also say to bosses, maybe like set the timer on that thing. So as opposed to
touche. Here's another audience question. It's a really interesting question about selection effects, right? So if millennials feel that the systems and structures of big law firms are inequitable, but then individually leave those spaces because they're not happy with them themselves, then how can we expect the spaces to change or the representation to reach parity? There seems to be a massive self-selection out of the process where millennials point to issues and concerns, but are not staying and doing the difficult work of transforming those spaces.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a really important point. I think one thing that we know is that it's very, very difficult to get individuals, if they have other options, to stay in unpleasant scenarios just for the kind of bigger picture goal of transforming them maybe for the next generation. So a lot of this does have to come, not from a kind of critical mass of people who decide to forego other opportunities or other ways of living in order to stay at a law firm, but from the folks who get left behind, who are looking around and saying, well, why don't we have enough people of color? Why don't we have enough women? And instead of putting the onus on all the groups that are fleeing because it isn't working for them, having some serious and open-minded conversations about what is and isn't working, and imposing some changes, and not expecting those changes necessarily to come from the folks who are already bearing most of the burden of the hardship. I know that's a really imperfect answer, And it does mean, I think, that change is going to be slower and it's going to be rocky. But I don't see a universe in which you convince people, especially people that are among the most privileged individuals in our entire society, right, which is lawyers and law firms who have a lot of opportunities and a lot of choices. I don't see how you convince a critical mass of those folks, someone like me, to stay in an unpleasant work scenario that's making them miserable for the greater good.
Wonderful. So I'm going to take these two new questions together because they both pertain to Gen Z. So one is, with the emergence of Gen Z into adulthood, how does that change the generational dynamics between boomers and millennials? How do Gen Zers differ from prior generations? And then this puts a little bit more heat on it and a little bit more of a topspin on the question. Separate question, but what are Gen Z perceptions of millennials in the workplace or otherwise? We don't hear much about that view. So, do you suddenly feel like you're looking at the Gen Zers and thinking like, oh, that person is, X, Y, or Z, and what are their perceptions of your generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen yet kind of a lot of research and data on this question, in part because Gen Zers are still pretty young. But the oldest Gen Zers, I may get this slightly wrong, but I think they're about 24, and the youngest are kind of older teens. So a lot of Gen Zers are still in high school or still in college. Many of them are not yet, at least in the workplace, kind of full time. But certainly, Gen Zers, I don't think always have the most generous view of millennials. I think they see us often the way we see boomers, which are people who have been kind of culturally, at least not politically, but culturally quite dominant, quite self-obsessed. I think where Gen Zers and millennials align a bit better is on the politics. Gen Zers are even more politically progressive than millennials are. They are more racially diverse than millennials are. They're actually less likely to be immigrants than millennials are, which I always think is interesting. Millennials have more immigrants in our cohort than any other. But so I do think some of the trends, workplace trends you see emerging from millennials are going to come into sharper focus with Gen Zers. I think a lot of this stuff is going to just get magnified, but I do think you're going to see Gen Zers turning some of their ire onto millennials the way that we have with boomers.
Wonderful. So we have 3 minutes left. I think we can squeeze in this last question because I think it's a good one and a great place to end. You mentioned that millennials are still often seen as children by many boomers, even though they are adults now. What can millennials do to help shape our own narrative in this regard?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, in many ways, millennial life does not have the same trappings of adulthood that boomer life had, right? We marry later, we have fewer kids, we're less likely to get married in the first place, and we're actually the most likely to still be living at home. So there's a record number of people, young people, or young being under the age of 40, living at home now, and coronavirus has kind of only exacerbated that. And so I think part of what is important for millennials to do is to think about how we define adulthood. And in the US, at least, adulthood has been typically defined by being a member of a nuclear family, by being an adult member of a nuclear family. So being married, having a kid, often owning your own home. In this very American, I think, kind of hyper individualistic way. And I think one thing that millennials can do is rethink, well, is adulthood defined by by a particular kind of life aesthetic, right? um you know I always think this concept of like shaping your own narrative is a little bit challenging, especially if you're a person who doesn't have as much power as the people who are creating your narrative for you. But I do think it's really valuable for millennials to think through, well, okay, if adulthood doesn't look like it did for my parents and grandparents, if that's frankly not how I even want adulthood to look, what comes up in its place, and what can our generation assert as the kind of new ways of living as fully vested and respected adults in American society. I don't think we figured that out yet, but I do think it's a really interesting question to work on.
I love that. As Alistair McIntyre says, we're never more than, co-authors of our own lives, right? But I think that we do have some agency in the way that we talk to ourselves at a minimum, right? So thinking about how there might not be this Procrustean bed of what it means to be an adult might be the beginning of that. So, erudite, brilliant, thoughtful, balanced, all the things that you were in this conversation, I feel like you also are in your book. So I highly encourage everyone to go out and get OK Boomer. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming back to NYU and spending some time with us, Jill.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.